Originally, I was going to do a neat intro outside in that graveyard that I was filming earlier, but I had some trouble. It was a little windy outside, the audio was a little scuffed, so now we are back in my room getting my eyes blown out by this ring light because I had to set up this ramshackle recording situation with some stuff that I had on hand. Today is going to be a very different type of video. If you follow me on Twitter, if you're in the Discord, or if you pay attention to a lot of the things that I've said in a lot of my videos, you probably already know that I'm very interested in the paranormal, the spiritual, and the esoteric. And this is the first video in a series that I'm going to be doing focusing on some of those topics. The main way that I'm going to be doing this is by reading various books and then doing sort of a review / discussion that springs out of what I read in said book. The book we are talking about today is called Stop Worrying, There Probably Is an Afterlife by Dr. Greg Taylor. So from this point forward, if I'm talking about a Taylor, it's this guy, and I will shorten the title of the book to Stop Worrying. Stop Worrying primarily concerns itself with the survival of consciousness hypothesis, which seeks to figure out if any part of human consciousness survives death. It's basically the science nerd version of asking, is there an afterlife? And don't freak out, because this hypothesis does not seek to validate any one individual religion or spiritual practice. It just asks the bare bones question, is it possible that there could be an afterlife? So without wasting any more time, let's get into the book and see if we can figure out what the hell happened to all of those people in the intro. Taylor opens up Stop Worrying, There Probably Is an Afterlife with an argument that, believe it or not, considering the difference in subject matter, is one that I've talked about several times in my previous videos. Over the past 700 years, humans have kind of been through a lot. Materialist science has kind of become the dominant cultural force that provides the structure for a lot of society. This is, of course, good because, one, you wouldn't be watching this video without the computing revolutions of the 20th century. And two, it's pretty cool to have like antibiotics and anesthetic and stuff instead of just dying in a ditch like some English peasant. It's also nice to be able to go to the dentist and not have him just pull out a bottle of whiskey and be like, well. However, myself and many other dudes significantly smarter than me have often stated that despite the many incredible benefits of living in a highly materialist society, the materialists also sort of have their blind spots. For example, many people are completely unaware that metaphysical topics, such as the afterlife, have in fact not escaped the burning Sauron's eye of academia. The Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia very famously explores topics like the afterlife and psi phenomena, and even has a massive archive of cases of children who claim to be reincarnated and can remember their past lives. And if you don't believe me, here's an excellent talk where they outline 50 years of evidence they've collected from their various academic studies and surveys. The University of Edinburgh in Scotland also has a very similar department. A lot of very big brains have been studying this stuff for a very long time, and the book that we are talking about today in this video outlines a lot of that research. Nietzsche said, God is dead, we killed him. Cosmologist Paul Davies said, it is fashionable to downplay the significance of consciousness, perhaps because of its perceived mystical associates. However, this is, in my view, a serious error. And I said, where the ghost bitches at? So, what exactly is the problem? What are these three identically intelligent peers trying to say? The term spiritual crisis gets thrown around a lot these days, both by shit posters online and religious maniacs alike. But it seems on some level to be true. People just don't really have anything to believe in anymore. So, how did we get here, and more importantly, does any of this fucking matter? Taylor's argument in Stop Worrying lays out 4 major blows to the spiritual ego of the human race. They are 4 blows that I largely agree with, and I've probably talked about all of them at some point or another in the past. The first is the discovery by Copernicus that the Earth is in fact not the center of the universe, and that it's actually orbiting the sun. Sorry, the church. You're gonna have to find another angle. The second was the discovery of Newton's laws of motion, which laid the groundwork for all of modern physics and created the fairly grim idea of the deterministic universe. To use an overplayed analogy, the deterministic universe is basically the idea that the universe is a giant pool table with an infinite amount of billiard balls set in motion by some past action, and that even the particles that make up the neurons in your brain are bouncing around deterministically, completely out of your own control. Next, we have the discovery of deep time, which proved that the Earth was more than likely a few billion years old instead of a few thousand years old. And finally, we have Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which proved beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt that even though there are still monkeys, we did, in fact, came from monkeys, smart guy. To make this list even worse, we now have the Big Bang Theory, which provides an excellent initial action for that entire deterministic universe thing I was talking about earlier, and we have a lot of the cosmos mapped out, which shows that Earth was even more backwater than initially thought. It would also seem that life gets more and more theoretically common with every new discovery in astrobiology. Before we get into where this leaves us, I want to pause for a second and say that all of this is good. It's good that we figured out where the Earth really is in space. It's good that we figured out that the Earth probably isn't 3,000 years old. It's good that Newton's laws of motion laid the framework for all of modern classical physics. And it's good that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution gave us a set of laws of life that we can use to extrapolate all kinds of things about how life evolved on this planet and put together the fossil record and all of that. Materialist science is good, and it does good things, and we've achieved a lot as a species, like making most porn free. So then, shut the fuck up, I hear the materialists say, and I say, no, because much like every other time we've reached some sort of a crossroads between science and philosophy, this one is probably going to end up being a little bit more complicated than we thought. At this point, by following the science, we have backed ourselves into a pretty depressing existential reality. We seem to be merely a bunch of apes that crawled out of goo on a backwater planet with no control over our destiny, that have existed for an irrelevant amount of time and will perish before a relevant amount of time has passed. As Stephen Hawking once put it, the human race is just a chemical scum on a moderately sized planet. Taylor compares this cursed knowledge to a satirical example put forth by Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In The Hitchhiker's Guide, a character builds a machine called the Total Perspective Vortex, which instantly gives the person who uses it the perspective of their place in the cosmos, which then completely annihilates their brain. I strongly agree with Taylor here that this is the best possible analogy for our current moment in history, and I've been screaming about it on the internet in different terms for years. Our science is so good, so accurate, and so watertight that we have created the total perspective vortex. Our brains have been annihilated, and now we're trying to put together the pieces. This sucks, and people aren't particularly enjoying it. Do you guys remember a while back in May of 2022 when we had the total lunar eclipse and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is supposed to be our ambassador to the stars, decided to spend the entire night going down a Twitter spiral about how lunar eclipses suck and are gay? Do you remember how pissed off everyone from every corner of society was? This is a very good example of the total perspective vortex in action. The human brain, in all likelihood, probably evolved to require some sort of a spiritual cosmology. That's why we get so pissed when guys like Neil get on the internet, tip their fedora, and say "milady." And it's also why Carl Sagan was the greatest science communicator of all time. Carl Sagan understood that in order for people to really grab a hold of material science and use it as their guiding principle, that it wasn't enough for it to replace spirituality. Science had to rise to meet the spiritual on even ground. In his book, The Demon-Haunted World, Sagan says the following: "Science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. When we recognize our place in an immensity of light years and in the passage of ages, when we grasp the intricacy, beauty, and subtlety of life, then that soaring feeling, that sense of elation and humility combined, is surely spiritual. So are our emotions in the presence of great art, or music, or literature, or acts of exemplary selfless courage, such as those of Mohandas Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. The notion that science and spirituality are somehow mutually exclusive does a disservice to both." When I go outside and look up at the night sky and see a total lunar eclipse among the stars, I'm looking directly into the eyes of my cosmic mother and being held in her arms. And when the Earth's shadow passes across the moon, I'm seeing all the light of all of the Earth's sunrises and sunsets at the same time. And that's why this is so fucking annoying. Shut up, Neil. God damn it. You were basically hand-selected by Carl Sagan himself to be the next guy, and you fuck up this bad. What happened? This sucks. This idea that spirituality and science are not mutually exclusive is one that Taylor also lays out in the first chapter of his book. Do you remember that quote that I said earlier from Paul Davies? It is fashionable to downplay the significance of consciousness, perhaps because of its perceived mystical associates. However, this is, in my view, a serious error. This is a great one for Taylor to pick for Stop Worrying because it highlights the major conflict between science and spirituality. Consciousness. Consciousness is kind of weird, and no one can really figure it out, and every time somebody thinks they're figuring it out, it gets worse. Remember when they were trying to say it was the microtubules? Nope. And the brain, of course, is always getting more complicated. Since consciousness is sort of a black box, and you can't really prove anyone other than you has it, it makes it virtually impossible to study. One famous quote comes from Stuart Sutherland: "Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has ever been written about it." This odd conflict between consciousness and science is the weak point in the armor of materialism that is usually attacked by anybody who is actually intelligent. Nobel Prize winning physicist Sir Roger Penrose has all kinds of interesting ideas about consciousness, and even Richard the Living Fedora Dawkins has admitted that consciousness might in fact be coming from somewhere outside the body, something that is so insane for a guy like him to say that I'm just going to play the clip.
By the way, I have thought about using the Nick Bostrom idea to solve the riddle of how we were talking earlier about why the human brain can achieve so much. Mm-hmm. I thought of this when my then 100-year-old mother was marveling at what I could do with a smartphone. Mm-hmm. And I could, look up anything in the encyclopedia. I could play her music that she liked and so on. She said, "But it's all in that tiny little phone." No, it's out there. It's in the cloud. And maybe most of what we do is in a cloud. So maybe if we are a simulation, then all the power that we think is in our skull, it actually may be like the power that we think is in the iPhone, but is that actually out there?
It's an interface to something else.
Yes.
I mean, that's what including Roger Penrose with panpsychism, that consciousness is somehow a fundamental part of physics, that it doesn't have to actually all reside inside our brain.
But Roger thinks it does reside in the skull, whereas I'm
Right.
suggesting that it doesn't, that there's a cloud.
The idea that consciousness may be fundamental to the universe is another one that has been gaining traction recently and has all kinds of wacky implications. So if you're going to admit that consciousness seems to be a bizarre phenomenon that might be fundamental to the universe, the obvious question arises. Is it possible that some form of consciousness survives after you die? And that is the question that Stop Worrying, There Probably Is an Afterlife is going to attempt to answer. I brought it all the way back around. I'm not rambling, you're rambling. Now, if you're a big boy science brain, you might be thinking, well, if consciousness survives death, then it does so through some sort of natural and measurable set of laws. So then, wouldn't we have evidence of it? And boy, did you walk in to the right video, because the remainder of Stop Worrying aims to provide just that via chapters on deathbed visions, near-death experiences, and studies of people who claim to be mediums. And don't freak out over that last one. Trust me, I fucking hate mediums, and this book had me looking at them from a little bit of a different angle that I think you will find is interesting. So sit down and pour one out for the dead homies, and let's get to answering the question. Should we stop worrying? And is there, in fact, probably an afterlife? Let's start off with, what is a deathbed vision? Well, it's a vision that somebody has on their deathbed, but they come in a few different varieties. Traditionally, the story goes somewhat like this. Imagine you're on your deathbed, or alternatively, if you are on your deathbed right now, look forward to this happening. Imagine you're sitting in a hospital, and maybe some friends or family members are around you, and all of a sudden, you start seeing the figure of your dead grandma in the corner of the room, and you say, hey, does anybody else see that? And they say, no, that's pretty nuts. And then your dead grandma says, I think it's time that we blow this scene, get everybody in their stuff together, 3, 2, 1, let's jam, and then shortly after that, you die. This is sort of the archetypal deathbed vision. They are widely reported across the entire world in a lot of different cultures. While many cultures assign great spiritual significance to these visions, in the West, these reports are largely considered to be ghost stories or the result of drugs or dementia or something else going on in the dying brain. Even though about 2/3 of doctors, nurses, and various other health professionals report having witnessed or heard of experiences like this in hospital rooms or palliative care units all over the place. However, as Taylor points out in the book, these things are a little bit more complicated once you get into the details. First of all, there have actually been some efforts to organize these reports and study them. One survey conducted found that 80% of patients who experience a deathbed vision were not actually under the influence of any drug. And in one insane case, a guy kept seeing visions of both his dead brother and a bunch of giant black spiders, and when they modified the amount of medication he was on, the spider visions went away, and the visions of his brother did not. It also seems that people that experience these deathbed visions do not exhibit any of the other signs associated with hallucinating, like fear or confusion. They just sort of calmly and objectively explain what they're seeing. Some of these visions are kind of comical, like this one. For instance, in Italy, a wife ran to her dying husband's side only to be told by him that her mother, who had died 3 years previously, is helping me to break out of this disgusting body. And there are also some more profound examples like this one. Just to provide a little bit of context for the paragraph that I'm about to read, Miss B is a woman who is dying shortly after childbirth. At that moment, Miss B focused on a particular point in the air and cried joyously, "Why, it's father, oh he's so glad I'm coming." A beatific vision then unfolded before her, something of such majestic and heavenly qualities that the new mother felt justified in leaving her newborn baby for it. Her baby was brought for her to see, and she looked at it with interest and then said, "Do you think I ought to stay for the baby's sake?" Then turning towards the vision again, she said, "I can't stay. I can't. If you could see what I do, then you would know that I can't stay." But she then turned to her husband, who had come in, and said, "You won't let the baby go to anyone who won't love him, will you?" And then she gently pushed him to one side, saying, "Let me see the lovely brightness." There are also many reports of totally healthy and living people seeing all sorts of strange things in the room around dying people, like bright lights or weird figures of odd apparitions, and also some completely insane shit like this example. Researcher O.O. Burgess recounted the case of a man, Mr. G, who experienced a vision that persisted for some 5 hours as he watched over his dying wife in May of 1902. The man's statement began with what he believed to be important information about his own beliefs and state of mind at the time. For the benefit of any who may read this paper, I will state that I am not addicted to the use of alcoholic liquors, cocaine, or morphine, being almost strictly temperate, nor am I nervous or imaginative, but considered cold, calm, and deliberate, and a disbeliever in what is known as materialization, spiritualism, or the existence of spiritual bodies visible to mortal eyes, and hostile to all such theories. But then he went on to outline exactly what he saw. "I happened to look toward the door when I saw floating through the doorway 3 separate and distinct clouds in strata. Each cloud appeared to be about 4 feet in length, from 6 to 8 inches in width, the lower one about 2 feet from the ground, the others at intervals of about 6 inches. My first thought was that some of our friends, and I must ask their pardon for the thought, were standing outside the bedroom smoking, and that the smoke was from their cigars being wafted into the room. With this idea, I started to rebuke them when, lo, I discovered there was no one standing by the door, no one in the hallway, no one in the adjoining rooms. Overcome with astonishment, I watched the clouds, and slowly but surely these clouds approached the bed until they completely enveloped it. Then, gazing through the mist, I beheld, standing at the head of my dying wife, a woman's figure about 3 feet in height, transparent and yet like a sheen of brightest gold, a figure so glorious in its appearance that no words can be used fitly to describe it. 2 figures in white knelt by my wife's side, apparently leaning towards her. Other figures hovered about the bed, more or less distinct. Then Mr. G noticed a cord extending from his wife's forehead to a nude, white figure hovering above the bed. At times, the figure struggled violently, threw out its arms and legs in an apparent effort to escape. Viewing this scene continually for some 5 hours, Mr. G believed himself to be losing his mind. I think the implications of that story more or less speak for themselves. It may be tempting to write off the deathbed vision as just another ghost story. You, watching this video right now, likely have never experienced a vision like this. And if you live in the US, we silo our dying family members off into hospice care and old folks' homes, so the odds of you being around very many of your family members who have died are pretty low, especially in the last couple years. However, these experiences do get a little bit more substantive than the ones I've mentioned so far. One type of deathbed vision, called the peak-in Darien experience, describes a scenario a little bit like this. Imagine that hypothetical from earlier, the one where your grandma was a very big fan of anime. Now imagine after about 2 days of seeing your grandma, you also see your older brother, who as far as you know, is still alive. Then you're like, damn, that's weird, and your family just assumes that you're seeing things. Then about 2 days later, you die, and your entire family finds out that your brother was in fact dead in some tragic accident that they are just now finding out about. This gives the deathbed vision a sort of prophetic quality, and these types of experiences are reported all the time. There's another type of deathbed vision, often called the crisis apparition. The term crisis apparition was invented by the Society for Psychological Research, or the SPR, and we're going to learn a lot about the SPR later. But for now, all you need to know is that the SPR was founded in 1882 during the peak of the spiritualism movement, and one of its major goals was to investigate and debunk claims of mediums and other paranormal events. Crisis apparition was a term created to describe an event where you see a family member that, as far as you know, is alive, and then they disappear, and then you find out they're dead. In their research, the SPR members found that while these stories sound like campfire ghost stories, they lack a lot of the scare factor that you would find from people just sort of making things up. They are typically very boring and delivered in a very matter-of-fact type of way. Something like, well, I was standing in my kitchen, and then my aunt showed up for a surprise visit, and then she disappeared and I couldn't find her, and later I got a phone call that she was dead. That's it. Not really spectacular or interesting or the kind of thing you would bother to make up. The deathbed vision in its many forms is very interesting to study. Even the most cynical among us would have to admit that although crisis apparitions and some Pekin-Darien events might be just some sort of ghost story created to deal with grief, it would seem that the vanilla deathbed vision is something that is actually happening to people. Whether you think it's some sort of psychological phenomena physically happening in the brain is up to you. But evidence does suggest that it's not drugs or mental illness. Some people have suggested that this might be due to a lack of oxygen in the brain, but doctors now have a pretty good understanding of what happens when the brain is low on oxygen, and the symptoms of a hypoxic brain don't really seem to match up with the symptoms of the deathbed vision. But what if there was something a little bit more substantive than the deathbed vision? For that, let's get into the next section of the book, which covers the legendary near-death experience. The near-death experience, or the NDE, probably doesn't need that much of an introduction because at this point, it's so well known. But for those who might not know, here's a brief history. Medical science has gotten very good. So good that we've had to change the definition of what death even means multiple times. Our technology is so good that you cannot have a heartbeat for, in some cases, literally hours and come back fine. Usually, this causes brain damage, but in some cases, where somebody is kept cold by icy water or something else in the environment, they can just come back all right. These breakthroughs in medical technology mean that we now have more people than at any other point in human history that were dead but got better, and thus the rise of the near-death experience. Taylor opens up this chapter of the book with a fictional, archetypal NDE from a book called Life After Life, published in 1975, that is widely regarded as the work that put the idea of the near-death experience into the public consciousness. This fictional example of an NDE is intended to provide all of the possible aspects of the NDE. Let's look at it and then talk about it. A man is dying, and as he reaches the point of greatest physical distress, he hears himself pronounced dead by his doctor. He begins to hear an uncomfortable noise, a loud ringing or buzzing, and at the same time feels himself moving very rapidly through a long, dark tunnel. After this, he suddenly finds himself outside of his own physical body, but still in the immediate physical environment. And he sees his own body from a distance as though he is a spectator. He watches the resuscitation attempt from his unusual vantage point and is in a state of emotional upheaval. After a while, he collects himself and becomes more accustomed to his odd condition. He notes that he still has a body, but one of a very different nature, and with very different powers from the physical body he left behind. Further, things begin to happen. Others come to meet him and help him. He glimpses the spirits of relatives and friends who have already died, and a loving, warm spirit of a kind he has never encountered before, a being of light, appears before him. This being asks him a question, non-verbally, to help him evaluate his life, and sometimes aids him in tasks by showing a panoramic, instantaneous playback of the major events in his life. At some point, he may find himself approaching some sort of barrier or border, apparently representing the limit between earthly life and the next life, yet he finds that he must go back to Earth and that the time of his death has not yet come. At this point, he resists, for by now he is taken up with the experiences in his afterlife and does not want to return. He is overwhelmed by intense feelings of joy, love, and peace. Despite his attitude, though, he somehow reunites with his physical body and lives. Once again, let me reiterate, this is a fictional NDE. It is simply meant to be the archetypal example. There is virtually no NDE that has every single one of these things in it, but most of them will have at least a few. One Dutch study found that 24% of NDEs feature an out-of-body experience, 31% include traveling through what looks like some kind of tunnel, 13% feature a life review, and 56% include feelings of peace and euphoria. There are plenty of accounts in this book and elsewhere that you can read for yourself if you want to take an inventory on which aspects of the experience are the most common. There have been many theorized explanations for what causes the NDE, but so far, absolutely none of them have really held up to any type of analysis. Of course, this doesn't mean they are the smoking gun proof of the afterlife, but it does mean that there's still kind of a mystery in psychology. One popular explanation revolves around that book that I mentioned earlier, Life After Life, by Raymond Moody, published in 1975. This explanation puts forward the idea that the NDE was something that only became widespread after the book was published, and now we are sort of in the post-NDE era, and people are psychologically primed to have an NDE, whereas prior to the book being published, they weren't as common. This theory has a lot of holes, though. First of all, there are plenty of examples of what we would consider to be the classic NDE experience that are reported well before 1975. Taylor lays out many examples in Stop Worrying of NDEs, both from ancient history, as there were a lot of cultures like the Greeks that were writing shit down, and from more modern history like the 1800s. It also seems that the idea of the NDE sort of transcends cultural lines. This is pretty inconvenient for the narrative that Moody started it all. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example, which was written in the 8th century, seems to have some pretty accurate depictions of what we now would consider to be the typical NDE experience. NDEs are also reported by children that are very young. We're talking 1 to 2 years old. Obviously, someone this young has absolutely no concept of what death is or what it really means, and I doubt they picked up life after life on their leap pad. So, what the fuck is going on here? What are some of the other proposed mechanisms for how an NDE might work? Well, luckily for us, there are academics working on this problem. At the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, which I discussed earlier, there's a guy who is considered to be somewhat of an expert on the NDE, and also conveniently was interviewed by Taylor for this book. His name is Dr. Bruce Greyson, and he is a professor of psychology and neurobehavioral sciences. And at the time of this book's publishing in 2013, Greyson had been studying NDEs for over 30 years. He was also the director of the Division of Perceptual Studies, so there aren't really very many more qualified people to attempt to figure out what the hell an NDE is. Unfortunately, his conclusion is basically this emoji. In a paper titled Explanatory Models for Near-Death Experiences, Greyson and his colleagues attempted to work through all of the most commonly proposed mechanisms for the NDE. These mechanisms are split into two categories: psychological and physiological. The psychological category puts forth ideas like the expectation model, where the expectations of someone's culture or religion prime them for the NDE. The depersonalization model, which puts forward the idea that the NDE is just some sort of traumatic dissociative state, and possibly one of the goofiest ones, the birth model, which puts forward the idea that when you're having an NDE, you're just remembering the time that you were born. This is also used to describe alien abductions, but we're not going to talk about aliens in this video that much. The physiological category, on the other hand, includes things like whacked out oxygen or CO2 levels in the brain, intrusive rapid eye movements, essentially creating some kind of waking dream, and even your brain dumping chemicals like endorphins, opioids, or psychedelics like DMT, which, believe it or not, actually exists in your brain naturally. This DMT explanation in particular is one that a lot of people have taken to heart for good reason. The symptoms of a high dose of DMT can include things like a buzzing sound in your ears, a feeling of being shot out of some kind of a tunnel, the life review, feelings of peace and euphoria, reported meetings with higher beings, and so forth. People also report the DMT experience being very difficult to describe or ineffable, which is something they also say about the NDE. The similarities between a DMT trip and the NDE are pretty hard to ignore, and from the right angle, the experiences seem almost identical. An entire book was written about this topic and the orbiting topics called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and I will almost for sure check out that book at some point in this series of videos. Also, to go even deeper into my complete insanity, a lot of DMT symptoms are also present in UFO and alien encounter stories. If you listen to people that claim to have been abducted by UFOs, they will describe buzzing noises in their ears, bright lights, and meeting beings that have all kinds of weird things to say, and having all kinds of experiences that are impossible to describe. Back in the early 90s, there was an event at a school in Zimbabwe where 60 school kids saw a UFO land and a little alien got out and walked around before taking off again. And this is one of the most well-documented UFO cases of all time, investigated by a child psychologist named John E. Mack, and much of the archival footage of those kids being interviewed still exists, and a lot of those kids reported having a buzzing sound in their ears, and all of them have stuck to their story as adults. This case is a little off the rails for this video though. If you're really interested in the deep dive of getting sold on this particular case, there's a very good documentary called Aerial Phenomenon, which came out in 2022, directed by filmmaker Randall Nickerson. Even if you don't believe in any of this shit, it's actually a very good emotional documentary, and I highly recommend it. The director has been working on it for like 20 years. It is incredible. My point is, isn't this weird? Like, am I going insane? Why would NDEs, DMT trips, and alien abductions all be so similar when described by people? Like, this is nuts, right? Like, more people should be talking about this. To get back on track, Grayson and his colleagues are unimpressed by literally all of these explanations and instead offer up the fact that not a single hypothesis has been advanced so far that explains the totality of the NDE experience. The expectation model falls apart once you realize that the NDE seems to have transcended the cultural and religious expectations of the people, and even happens in children who have no idea what death even is. The blood gas theories and other neurochemical theories have not been able to be replicated in a laboratory setting, and it just isn't looking good on the great front of trying to figure out what is going on here. In fact, NDEs often run totally counter to the cultural and spiritual expectations of the person experiencing them, which is one of the reasons why they have such a profound and life-changing effect on some people. Grayson goes on to say that not only does not a single one of the proposed mechanisms explain the entire NDE, but there are certain aspects of the NDE that aren't explained by even one of these hypotheses put forward so far. One of the most wacky and so far unmentioned aspects is something referred to as accurate out-of-body perception. Cases where people are accurately able to report things that have happened to them while they were unconscious from the perspective of an out-of-body experience. In NDE studies, this is called veridical perception, and it's going to be the next level of the rabbit hole that we go down. As usual, let's open up with one of the book's examples to really put what we are talking about into perspective. Al Sullivan, a 56-year-old van driver, was at work on a Monday morning in early 1989 when his heartbeat suddenly became irregular. Admitted to Hartford Hospital in Connecticut, Sullivan was undergoing a diagnostic testing when one of his arteries became blocked. He was then rushed into the operating room for what became quadruple bypass surgery. During this operation, Sullivan suddenly felt his consciousness separate from his physical body, and after traveling through a black, billowy, smoke-like atmosphere, found himself looking down from above on his own life-saving surgery. I was laying on a table covered with blue sheets, and I was cut open so as to expose my chest cavity. It was in this cavity that I was able to see my heart on what appeared to be a small glass table, and I was able to see my surgeon, who just moments ago had explained to me what he was going to do during my operation. He seemed to be somewhat perplexed. I thought he was flapping his arms as if trying to fly. At the time of witnessing this strange behavior from the surgeon, Sullivan also noted that his own chest cavity was being held open by metal clamps and was equally puzzled by the fact that two other surgeons were working on his leg rather than his heart. In any case, it was then that I turned my attention to the lower right-hand side of the place I was at and saw the most brilliant yellow light coming from what appeared to be a very well-lit tunnel. That light that came from the tunnel was of a golden yellow hue, and although it was the brightest I had ever looked into, it was of no discomfort to the eyes at all. Then, preceded by warmth, joy, and a peace, and a feeling of being loved, a brown-cloaked figure drifted out of the light toward me as my euphoria rose still more. I, much to my delight, recognized it to be that of my mother who had died at age 37 and when I was 7 years old. As soon as he regained consciousness and was able to talk, Sullivan told his cardiologist, Dr. Anthony LaSala, of his amazing experience. Initially skeptical, Dr. LaSala immediately paid more attention when Sullivan described the flapping of elbows of the cardiac surgeon, Dr. Hiroshi Takada, as this was an idiosyncratic habit of his that Dr. LaSala had witnessed himself after scrubbing in. Dr. Takada would point at things using his elbows to avoid contamination of his hands, giving the impression that he was impersonating a chicken attempting to fly. And in case you were wondering, the description of the surgery was also very accurate. And there's another story in the book following that one of a guy who lost his dentures during the surgery, and when he couldn't find them, he told the doctors, "You put them in the drawer during the surgery, dum-dum," and then the doctors checked the drawer, and sure enough, the dentures were in there, implying that somehow, while the man was unconscious on the table, he was able to see where the dentures went. These types of accounts of people being able to accurately describe what's going on in a room where they, for all intents and purposes, are dead are pretty common, and you can find reports of them in this book and pretty much all over the place. At this point, some of the more large-brained people in my audience are once again thinking, well, great, this is something that has concrete physical evidence that we should, in theory, be able to test. And if you are thinking that, you are thinking correct, and so are all the people that are right now studying this phenomenon. We even already have some positive results from people attempting to test this. In the 1960s, a professor named Charles T. Tart ran an experiment with a woman who reported having regular out-of-body experiences, or OBEs, where he placed a sheet of paper with a 5-digit number on top of a shelf in the corner of the room and then hooked up the lady to an EEG, the theory being that if she really was leaving her body and wasn't completely full of shit, she would be able to sort of float up above the room, read the number, and then report the number back to him. And since she was hooked up to an EEG machine the entire time, there was no way that she could do some scam where she disconnected the machine or something and climbed up the shelf to look and cheat. On the 4th day of the study, the EEG machine started producing some weird results, and the woman woke up and accurately reported the entire 5-digit number, something with a 1 in 100,000 odds, pretty difficult to do by chance. These studies also continue well into the modern day, and the study highlighted in this book is called the AWARE Project, started by a guy named Dr. Sam Parnia. The goal of the AWARE Project was for doctors all over the world who work in coronary units to conduct interviews with people who suffered cardiac arrests and try to determine if the OBEs people were having were accurate. As many of the surgical rooms as possible had shelves installed with little notes on top of them, similar to the ones I talked about in the previous example. The idea here is that although fully conscious OBEs are very rare, if we have doctors all over the place trying to confirm one, eventually we should be able to get a hit. But if you sit down and think about this, there are once again a lot of holes. Someone has to end up in the hospital with a doctor doing the research, then they need to end up in a hospital room with the shelf installed, then the patient needs to have an OBE, then the patient needs to survive to be able to complete the interview, and the patient has to then actually complete the interview, and they also need to provide some sort of verifiable evidence that they aren't bullshitting during the interview. Luckily for us, the results of the first round of the AWARE studies are publicly available. Out of 2,060 cardiac arrest events, 140 people survived to be interviewed, 101 actually completed their interview, 9 of them had NDEs, 2 of those people had OBEs with memories of their environment, and only 1 of those had evidence that could verify the experience. Now, 1 in 2,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but bear in mind there are 356,000 episodes of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and 209,000 episodes of in-hospital cardiac arrest every year. So 2,000 events is a pretty small sample size, and one verifiable hit is pretty interesting news. According to these numbers, we are looking at something like 565,000 cardiac arrest events every year, and there are potentially over 280 people that could have a verifiable experience. Alright, so far we've gone over a lot of information, so let's take a break for a minute and talk about what we've covered. It would seem that a percentage of people all over the world on their deathbed are having profound near-death experiences. And it would also seem that a percentage of them are having experiences where they can accurately describe what's going on around them in a room when they should, for all intents and purposes, be dead. And a very small percentage of the people in that last category are able to provide verifiable physical evidence that they aren't full of shit. This is, to use a technical term, pretty bonkers. Materialist physics in biology and all of the other sciences have proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the world can be boiled down and defined by rules. The reason I'm so good at archery is because I know that the arrow is going to travel in a predictable path that I can control. The Earth moves in a predictable path around the sun, and quantum physics can accurately predict the movement of individual particles, and the list goes on and on. So what would we expect something with definable rules to look like? Well, it would look the same to everyone, no matter their culture or location on Earth, and that seems to be the case with the near-death experience. It probably would have been documented for all of human history, and that part seems to match up with everything that we have talked about so far. And most importantly, it would be measurable in some way, and that also seems to be the case. This is all pretty interesting when you sit down and put it on paper. But now is not the time for the conclusion of this video or this book, because we still have one last thing to cover. The thing that I know for a fact is going to be the most controversial part of this entire video, and the part that I was personally the most skeptical of. Mediums. Let me be clear right off the bat. I don't like mediums. Mediums are, without a doubt, some of the most untrustworthy, manipulative, and unethical con men in the entire paranormal space, and they have been for literally centuries. I have never in my life experienced a medium that wasn't using very obvious techniques such as cold reading or hot reading or muscle reading to very obviously suss out the information that they were claiming to be getting from spooky ghosts. Professional mediums in particular can never be trusted, and it's a general rule of thumb in the paranormal community that if somebody is asking you for money, they're probably full of shit. But the chapter on mediums in this book is very compelling and had a lot of information that I was not aware of that shows that there might be something going on with mediums and that it is observable and testable. Does this mean that mediums are talking to the dead? No, it doesn't. But before we get into the details, I need to give you some historical context so that you understand the terminology that I'm going to be throwing around in this part of the video. First of all, what is a medium? A medium is someone who is allegedly able to get information specifically from the spirits of the dead or some sort of spirit world. This is different from a psychic who claims to be able to get information from some sort of nebulous and mysterious sixth sense or something. As you will find out soon, the difference between these two is very controversial. Mediums have existed all throughout human history in a variety of different forms, and at one point or another, pretty much every culture will have a class of people that claim to be able to talk to the dead. However, the mediums that we are going to be talking about today are of the type that primarily began to appear during the mid-1800s during the meteoric rise of the spiritualism movement. What is the spiritualism movement? Well, if you've ever seen a dumbass horror movie where they do a spooky seance in a dark room, or if you imagine the stereotypical Victorian parlor room seance, that's pretty much the epitome of the spiritualism movement. It was a movement that was all about getting together with the boys and trying to talk to ghosts, both for entertainment reasons and for the reasons that you would expect, like getting closure over a dead family member. You may have noticed that spiritualism isn't particularly popular anymore. People older than their teenage years rarely perform seances, and spirit communication is reserved almost exclusively for the different types of various TV carnival barkers like my man, Zach Baggins.
Right now, I am legitimately afraid to walk inside this door and allow myself to be surrounded by hundreds of clowns.
The reason for this is because the spiritualist movement was famous for being rife with con men and frauds, and this is, of course, unsustainable in the long run, as you might imagine. During this point in time, there was one particular group of people that were very interested in exposing said frauds and con men: the Society for Psychological Research, or the SPR. I mentioned we would be talking about these guys in detail in an earlier part of the video, and this is the part of the book where they become very important. The SPR really had one major goal, and that goal was to determine if there really was any evidence for the survival of consciousness after death, or if everyone was just completely full of shit. And oh man, did they bust ass on fake mediums. Something fierce. The SPR was absolutely brutal when it came to rooting out frauds. They were sure to employ not only scientists, but also magicians and even other ex-mediums who knew all of the tricks of the trade and knew how to perform all of the common and complex illusions used by mediums to make you think you were seeing a funny little ghoul in a crystal ball or whatever. The SPR is often cited as being pretty much the sole reason for the downfall of spiritualism because they just fucking cleared house so effectively. Almost no one stood up to the rigors of the SPR's genuinely scientific research, but that almost part is important because some people, as we are about to see, did. And not only did they stand up to the SPR's detailed research, but they did it for decades. Although the SPR is mostly famous today for proving that mediums are bullshit and the afterlife is fake and gay, their real conclusion was much more nuanced. The chapter in Stop Worrying About Mediums is easily the longest and the most complex, and it very easily could be its own 2-hour-long video just by itself. In order to try to avoid this video being even more of a monster than it already is, I'm going to boil it down to looking at just the 3 major bullet points which I think are the most important. The specifically named medium who provided the best and most compelling results over a 20-year period, some of the more complex international research done by the SPR, and some of the more modern research being done on mediums today. First, let's get into the famous medium. It is time for the legend of Leonora Piper. Leonora Piper was obviously an alleged medium, but her story holds significantly more water than any of the others I have ever heard. First of all, she managed to dodge a lot of the red flags commonly associated with fraud. She didn't receive payment for anything she did. She only did private readings for friends and family, and she was also somewhat embarrassed to perform the readings around other people because she thought the trance state she entered was embarrassing. When Leonora would begin doing readings, she would start to seize up, grind her teeth, and genuinely look like she was not having a very fun time. Eventually, she would enter some kind of a trance, and different personalities would start to take over, and it was in this trance state that these personalities were allegedly able to contact the spirits of the dead. Most people that she worked with believed that these different personalities were pieces of her subconscious and that she was entering some kind of weird meditation. These trances looked so uncomfortable and so painful that most of her family members insisted that they must be real, because why would anybody put themselves through that for no reason? But of course, as is usual when you are casting warlock magic of this caliber, Leonora's reputation began to leak out into the public and her legend spread. Eventually, the SPR caught wind of Leonora and immediately sent out one of their best hitmen to expose her for being the obvious con woman she was. Richard Hodgson was an experienced member of the SPR who had already developed somewhat of a reputation, taking down at least one big-named fake medium. And he was ready to bust ass on Leonora. Unfortunately, her case became significantly more difficult to crack than anyone he had previously dealt with. At this point, it's probably really important that we go over some of the more commonly used tactics by fraudulent mediums. The first and easily most common is something called cold reading, and it's often combined with something called the Forer effect. The Forer effect is most often used by shitty horoscopes that are written so vague that they could apply to literally anyone, and because of the biases in the human brain, the person reading them assumes that they apply to themselves specifically. Combining this with a strong enough intuition and enough practice, you can pull off incredibly impressive feats by using a technique known as cold reading, and this looks like the footage of every single medium you have ever seen. For example, I might say something to a group of people like, "I'm getting a K, I'm feeling a name that starts with a K," and then some lady in the back of the group goes, "Oh my god, my aunt's name was Karen," and then I now know that this woman had an aunt that she was probably close with who is now dead, and I say, "Yeah, I think it is your Aunt Karen, and she's telling me that there's some major event or problem that is over now and you should forgive yourself." And now, because family is family and humans are humans, there probably in all likelihood was some sort of conflict between this made-up woman and her aunt, and she goes, "Oh my god, Jacob, you're a powerful wizard. Here's $50. That is cold reading. The next technique, hot reading, is significantly easier to explain. Hot reading is simply researching your target beforehand, and in the days of the internet, if you know that Kevin Bingus is coming into your Medium parlor ahead of time, you can research all of his social media, all of his public documents, and learn everything there is to know about him before he even walks into your store, making the medium reading very, very easy. And finally, a more rare and advanced technique is called muscle reading. With muscle reading, a medium makes physical contact with the person that they are reading, usually by holding their hands, and by being able to feel the very subtle movements that people make while they're talking, the medium is able to get shockingly accurate information about what the person is thinking and doing. This seems dumb and not real, but trust me, street magicians and performers have provided tons of examples of how effective it is. An experienced professional medium can take advantage of all three of these tricks and more to put on a very convincing performance. So convincing, in fact, that some mediums don't even really realize they're fakes and have actually even convinced themselves that they are talking to ghosts. Richard Hodgson, who was very experienced in dealing with professional mediums, was well aware of these common tricks, and when meeting with Leonora, he would make sure to take steps to prevent them from happening. He also had a few advantages. First, he was from Australia, And since this was 1887, well before anything even remotely resembling the information age that we live in today, and Leonara was located in Boston, it was extremely unlikely that she would have been able to do any hot reading. Especially since Hodgson also concealed his identity. During these readings, Hodgson deliberately took steps to avoid feeding Leonara any information she could use for cold reading, and avoiding physical contact to dodge muscle reading was also relatively straightforward. Despite all of these steps, Leonara was able to recount some genuinely spooky details about Hodgson's life. 7 years previous to meeting Leonara, Hodgson had a girlfriend named Jessie who he was very close to. In his own words, she was closer than any other person had ever been. As you can probably assume, based on context, Jessie was dead. Leonara not only accurately reported his lost love's name, but she was also to tell Hodgson specific details of a private conversation that only the two of them would have known about. But it gets even weirder. Hodgson's girlfriend had a very, very specific, rare genetic abnormality called a coloboma, which causes the iris of the eye to look something like this. When Hodgson asked Leonara to draw Jessie's eye, she drew these images, which, according to Hodgson, were dead accurate. He was particularly surprised by the detail of the jagged edges. And if this wasn't enough for you, Leonara was studied by Hodgson for 7 years, to the extent that he even hired private investigators to tail her, and no evidence of fraud was ever found. Leonara was also physically tested. While she was in her trance state, Hodgson and others would do things like stab her with needles, poke her with hot match heads, shove ammonia-soaked rags in her face, and other means of semi-violent harassment to try to get a response. She never reacted. All right, let's take a break. I'm wearing a different shirt now. What kind of a psycho cares about continuity in a YouTube video anyway? What were we just talking about? I think we were at the part where Leonara was getting poked, stabbed with needles, and burnt with hot matches, which I guess brings me to the next part of the story. Later on in the investigations, Leonara took to communicating via automatic writing, where she would write down the messages she was getting on a piece of paper that would then be read by the person that she was reading. In one of these recorded readings, she was able to write 2 readings at the same time, one with her left hand and one with her right hand, which I suppose could be fake, but respect for developing that kind of a skill. Leonara Piper went on to work with the SPR for 20 years. They were never able to find any evidence of her being a fraud. The powerful necromancer known as Leonara Piper is a compelling story being told by narrators that we can assume are reliable. But at the end of the day, more skeptical minds can simply write it off as a legend, a fabrication, or some sort of extremely elaborate hoax put on by what I would argue, by hook or by crook, is the greatest medium of all time, whether or not she was a fake or the real deal. And for this reason, it's probably a good time that we get into some of the SPR's more complex research. Over the years, the SPR collected a very small handful of mediums that were able to make it through their severe battery of, in some cases, decades-long testing. In addition, a number of hobbyist amateur mediums had cropped up in the ranks of the SPR. Many people involved in this sort of field of study, like mediums or even remote viewers, will tell you that anyone can develop these skills with enough practice. And that's exactly what a lot of the members of the SPR attempted to do. After 20 years or so, the SPR had acquired a sort of gang of reliable mediums they could trust, located all over the world. This network allowed them to do what is without a doubt their most complex investigation of the phenomena of mediums: the cross-correspondence. But before I get into the details of the cross-correspondence, I have to get into why it was created. There's a debate among people who study mediums, one that rages even into the modern day. As you'll soon find out in this video, compelling evidence, like the feats of Leonora Piper, for the validity of mediums continues well into the modern day. The great debate in this field of research is, are mediums really talking with the dead, or are they simply gaining access to information through some sort of strange, intuitive sense that science hasn't figured out yet? Are they talking to ghosts, or are they talking to some kind of collective consciousness? Michael Persinger, a Canadian-American professor of psychology who worked at Laurentian University from 1971 to his death in 2018, is famous for doing great research on psychic phenomenon, most notably remote viewing. You can watch one of his great lectures right here on YouTube. Persinger created a hypothesis that essentially every human is tapped into some sort of field of consciousness, and that with enough practice, you can pull very small pieces of information out of that field. To many, an explanation like this seems much more plausible than the idea that the medium is speaking to dead people. The cross-correspondence experiments conducted by the SPR were designed to finally solve this debate. This part of the book is kind of confusing, but I'll do my best to try to explain it. For the sake of argument for a minute, let's assume that mediums really are talking to the spirits of the dead. If this is the case, then theoretically, it should be possible for multiple mediums to contact the same spirit. If you have multiple mediums all over the world, and multiple teams working on these multiple mediums, then theoretically, you could do readings all over the place contacting the same spirit. Now, if the spirit is sort of in on the research, you could create a scenario where the spirit gives each of these several teams a little bit of information, and then when all the readings are done, the teams could come together, compare notes, and sort of put the puzzle created by the spirit together. Then if their conclusion is correct, they could verify with their ghost friend whether or not they solved the puzzle correctly. This would then imply that mediums really are getting their information from some sort of spirit instead of just pulling the information out of some kind of aether. This is exactly what the cross-correspondents were. They were absurdly complex, so complex and so personal to the people that ran the experiments, and the puzzles put on by the ghosts were so complicated, involving things like obscure literary references, that 50 papers were written documenting these studies, and many of these 50 papers are literally book length. That's how much time and context it takes to accurately explain these experiments. These studies are widely regarded as the magnum opus of the SPR, and in the end, most of the members of the SPR decided that enough evidence had been collected to show that consciousness survived death in some way. Now, this conclusion is very important because of how vague it is. Remember, we aren't trying to make any specific claims here. We are strictly only speaking on the hypothesis that some aspect of consciousness may survive death. The SPR, after 20 years of work, figured that the evidence pointed towards this hypothesis being true. Now, it's important to cool our jets a little bit here, because although the SPR does exist today, their famous golden age of busting mediums and slipping 50s into the thongs of ghost strippers are a literal century behind us. We weren't there to witness the witchery of Leonora Piper, and we definitely weren't there for the absurdly complex cross-correspondence experiments, and while the SPR seemed convinced that they were talking to ghosts, I'm personally not convinced that this isn't some sort of strange, intuitive, cosmic sense that some people can tap into. Because, think about it. By solving this big, complicated puzzle put to you by a spirit, aren't you sort of still, by some reverse causality, putting that puzzle out into the collective conscious? Couldn't mediums still kind of be picking up on that? I feel like when we get into metaphysics this deep, real, solid conclusions kind of can't exist. Luckily, though, a lot of people have continued this research into the modern era, and the modern research is significantly more strict and buttoned down than the SPR days of old. In the modern age, science has gotten a lot more strict and a lot more rigid than it was in the late 1800s. If you want to convince Neil Moonhate Tyson to believe in ghosts, you've got a lot of heavy lifting to do. And the people doing this modern research understand that. In order to explain how tight the controls are on modern experiments, we need to get two terms straight. The medium is obviously the medium, and the sitter is the person receiving the reading. Now, there are a bunch of challenges here. We need to avoid cold reading and the Forer effect, hot reading, and muscle reading. This means that the medium cannot, under any circumstances, know who the sitter is, be around the sitter at any point, look at the sitter, smell the sitter, or even confirm whether or not the sitter is real. Next, the sitter needs to also be blind to the reading and be blind to which reading is their reading. Because if they know which reading is their reading, then they will assign significance to it that isn't really there. The idea is that you have the medium blind to the sitter and the sitter blind to the medium in order to reduce information coming into the system as much as possible. One of the major studies talked about in Stop Worrying was published in 2011 and conducted by Dr. Emily Kelly of, where else, the University of Virginia. This study was also conducted with a former hospice worker named Diane Archangel. I don't know whether or not this is a normal name or a World of Warcraft name. This study employed 9 mediums to do a reading on 40 sitters. Of course, in accordance with the methods outlined earlier, the mediums were blind to the sitters, and the sitters were not allowed to hear the results of the reading. The two sat in separate locations while the researchers recorded the medium's reading. After these readings were completed, each of the 40 sitters were sent 6 unmarked readings. 1 was theirs and the other 5 were decoys. They were then asked to rate each reading on how applicable they were to themselves, and give the reading they believed to be theirs the highest rating. In the end, 14 out of the 38 readings were correctly chosen, which seems small, but by the standards of statistics is much higher than what you would expect by random chance. And maybe even more insanely, 30 out of the 38 readings were correctly chosen to be at least in the top 50%. And there was one particular medium out of the 9 chosen mediums in which all 6 of her sitters correctly guessed which reading was theirs. This data is interesting for a lot of reasons. It seems that mediumship is a somewhat unreliable but statistically relevant skill that exists. The book goes on to describe a couple of other similar experiments with varying results that I highly recommend you read if you're interested. Some modern medium researchers claim that their evidence shows that mediums are contacting dead people. I'm not convinced. The evidence is definitely interesting and exciting, but as far as I'm concerned, that great debate between talking to ghosts and having some weird psychic sense continues to rage on. However, I am far more willing to give mediums the time of day than I was before I read this book. This has been an incredibly long video, and we have finally reached a point where maybe we can get to a real conclusion on the question being begged by this book's title. Should we in fact stop worrying, and is there probably an afterlife? Like I mentioned before, it seems like some of this evidence is pointing in the direction of something that is coherently measurable and predictable. NDEs, OBEs, and Deathbed Visions seem to kind of be the same for a lot of very different people across a broad swath of both culture and time. Some studies on these things, like the AWARE project we talked about earlier, have even produced some positive results, although I don't think it's nearly enough to make a conclusion. And in all likelihood, it never will be. Studying these topics is hard, and recreating things like NDEs is very difficult. We can't exactly go around drowning people and bringing them back until we have enough evidence to prove it one way or the other. Even studies like the AWARE project, though well-intentioned, will require literally decades of runtime before they start to piece together coherent data that can be analyzed. But in the end, I think it's fair to say that the title of this book is more or less correct. All of this to me suggests that we may very well could be looking at some sort of natural physical process that could be a precursor to some sort of an afterlife. And in the end, I don't think this is even really a particularly surprising or interesting find. Paradigm shifts happen in science all the time. First, the sun moves around the Earth, then the Earth moves around the sun, then we are no longer the center of the universe, then we are no longer the only galaxy, then the number of galaxies becomes incomprehensible, the number of planets becomes even worse, and the type of life that we are on this planet ends up probably not even really being that rare or special. High-level physics contends with absurd ideas that we are led to by the math all the time. Ideas like the holographic universe theory, for example, which deals with the idea that we might not even be three-dimensional, and that the information that makes up the universe could be stored somewhere else, creating the illusion that we are three-dimensional beings moving through three-dimensional space. This would mean everything that makes you is stored non-locally. What the fuck does that imply? Black holes are also insane and still have mysterious properties that we are trying to figure out, and even the fundamental question of why is there something instead of nothing is like a multi-decade project to discuss with no answer. My point is, it's weird out there, and every time we think we have a grasp on it, it gets weirder. At the end of the day, if we had evidence that consciousness survives death, would the universe really be that much more of an oddity? I think we are kind of living in an era where the wrong types of people have been able to get a monopoly on the idea of an afterlife, when in reality, the bare bones survival hypothesis is much less sensational and interesting than it appears once you put it into the context of the universe that we already know for sure we live in. No one alive really knows for sure if there is an afterlife. It doesn't matter if you're wearing a funny hat, a funny shirt collar, drinking a funny drink in the jungle, standing under a funny shrine in Japan, or maybe most importantly, shitposting on the funny bird app. No one knows. All we can say for sure is that there might be a little bit of evidence out there telling us, stop being so fucking cynical and believe in something. Get a little bit spiritual. You don't need to go to church. You don't need to eat a fistful of weird mushrooms. You don't need to do some elaborate ritual in a temple on a mountain. Just fucking believe in a little bit of mystery. Having a little bit of faith beyond what you have literally right in front of you isn't going to kill you. Good science and good faith are not mutually exclusive. Finally, the next time you are stressing out about your own dreaded existential mortality as a being cursed with abstract thought, try to remember. Stop worrying, because there probably is an afterlife. Welcome to the credits. The lighting is going to be a little bit weird on this one because it's nighttime, but I don't care because it's the end of the video. The damage is already done. I got you. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing, a like and a comment. Also, really help out. And, of course, as always, because of YouTube's nightmare system, it really helps out if you turn on all notifications for my channel. A lot of people have not been getting notified of my new uploads. So, do the bell and all that fucking nonsense. You should also follow me over on Twitter if you don't want to miss any updates at ProbablyJacob.io. I also stream on Twitch from time to time, twitch.com/ProbablyJacob. ProbablyJacob. And down in the description, you can find a link to the active Discord community where you can watch this guy try to make a Cruelty Squad Minecraft texture pack. I also run a podcast called Inherently Optimistic, which you can find, of course, anywhere where podcasts are. And if you want access to exclusive episodes of the podcast, or just want to support the channel, you can head over to patreon.com/ProbablyJacob, where for as little as $2 a month, you can fund me read 17 books about aliens and make the most unhinged video you've ever seen. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.